This presentation is about American author Mary Rowlandson, who lived from 1637 to 1711, and her Indian captivity narrative called A Narrative of the Captivity and Restoration of Mrs. Mary Rowlandson. Who is Mary Rowlandson? Mary Rowlandson was the Puritan wife of Joseph Rowlandson, minister of the frontier village of Lancaster, Massachusetts. She was attacked and abducted by a band of Indians at sunrise on February 20th, 1676, during the bloodiest war in colonial American history, King Philip's War. She was forced to live in captivity among the Indians for almost 3 months as they fled through the wilderness away from the colonial militia until she was ransomed for 20 pounds that was collected by the colonial women of Boston. Upon returning home, she wrote of her ordeal in one of the first Indian captivity narratives, a very popular 17th century genre on the adventures and stories of survival on the colonial frontier. Indian captivity narratives recounting the attack, capture, and escape of colonists by Native Americans were immensely popular, and Rowlandson's was no exception. Her nonfiction tale of being attacked, held captive for almost 3 months, and eventually ransomed in a strange, far-off land by exotic people was full of gory details, excitement, bravery, and adventure. Its style is straightforward and simple, and the plot moves quickly with each remove or adventure. Another typical characteristic of Indian captivity narratives, which is also true of Rowlandson's, is how it reveals the biases against the Native Americans and the religious beliefs of the Puritans. Indian captivity narratives were the precursor to the American cowboy tales and pioneer epics that became popular later in American literary history. How were the Native Americans portrayed in the narrative? Even though the Native Americans who attacked and held Rowlandson captive were people she and her fellow townspeople knew and had traded with for years, she describes them in the narrative as fiends, seen as instruments of the devil who have come to test her faith. The Puritans viewed Native Americans as evil savages. The romanticized view of Native Americans as noble savages came later in American history. She describes the brutal attack with very gory details of men, women, and children being knocked in the head, stripped naked, and having their bowels split open. She calls the attackers murderous wretches, bloody heathen, infidels, and ravenous beasts. Undoubtedly, the attack was brutal, but yet there were signs that the Native Americans were not completely merciless, as they do spare Rowlandson her life, and later allow her to even get paid for making articles of clothing for them. And they freed her and showed her moments of kindness and compassion. King Philip's War was certainly violent and horrific, as most wars, but Rowlandson's narrative focuses primarily on the brutality of the Native Americans, without mention of any brutal treatment of the Native Americans by the colonists. Puritan religious views portrayed throughout the narrative. As was typical of Puritan literature, Rowlandson quotes the Bible throughout the entire narrative. Consistent with the Puritan view that God was intimately involved in their lives, Rowlandson views her attack, captivity, and ultimate ransom as God's means of teaching her not to value worldly joy, but to focus on the hereafter. She uses the following passages from the Bible. Quote, "It is good for me that I have been afflicted." End quote. For, as she goes on to write, quote, "The Lord hath showed me the vanity of these outward things, that they are the vanity of vanities, and vexation of spirit, that they are but a shadow, a blast, a bubble, and things of no continuance, that we must rely on God himself, and our whole dependence must be upon him." End quote.